Welcome to a live taping of the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Ganzeer, a muralist and visual artist who has been heralded for his work across the years. He has exhibited all over the world and has been featured in some of the most widely read magazines and newspapers. It is an absolute thrill to have you joining us. Ganzeer, welcome to Afikra.
Mikey, thank you for having me. It's totally my honor.
So I'm going to start with the first question that I asked you actually when I joined, and we started talking a few minutes ago, which is, what should I call you? And the answer was Ganzeer. But I'd love to know the story behind that. Where did that come from? And what was the process of deciding all right, this is it.
Yeah.
This is going to be my pseudonym.
It was half an accident a little bit. So way back in, I want to say 2005-ish, I started a design studio with a group of friends, and I came up with the name Ganzeer at the time for the studio. At the time, no one had the brand for whether it was a design studio or agency or even a lot of hospitality kind of cafes sort of businesses or so on. No one used Arabic names. It would always be
it wasn't cool.
It was you do cilantro for a coffee shop, which doesn't make any sense, or you do a Lighthouse Productions for some whatever design, whatever it is, right? It was just so first it started from a point of it has to be an Arabic and kind of more specific and even Egyptian kind of sounding term. Ganzeer specifically, the idea came from that as several individuals in the studio, each one of us could be kind of a link in the chain, so to speak. And then also the chain itself, the Ganzeer usually on a bicycle is what connects kind of the gears, the pedals to the wheels, right? It allows the bicycle to move forward, and in general, in any kind of machine, you're going to have that kind of connective element in a way. And so just this idea that as a Ganzeer is not necessarily the source of the propulsion. So take that analogy and apply it to society. Again, like designers and artists, it's not necessarily that we have to be the source of ideas or the source of inventing stuff as much as by simply connecting certain ideas together, we allow kind of hopefully society to propel forward in a sense. But basically how it became a pseudonym and no longer my studio kind of name was over the course of time. The studio sort of disbanded a little bit over creative differences, and it was mostly just me in the studio. And so, clients who would later become friends over time, it is Egypt, would start to refer to me as my person. Oh, I'm going to Ganzeer, referring to the person Ganzeer, not really the place anymore,
Yeah.
So I just started to when I started to make the move to do more art kind of in the gallery circuit, and I was already kind of known as Ganzeer, I was like, all right, I guess I might as well just be Ganzeer. And that's kind of how it happened.
That's how it stuck. For the Arabic speakers, Ganzeer means chain, non-Arabic speakers. So I'm curious about, a lot of times when I introduce people, it's interesting how much value is put on where somebody's from, right? So a lot of your bios say, Egyptian artist Ganzeer. Do you feel like that is the first word in the way you think about your own identity?
Definitely not. No. And I say this, I don't want it to sound like I'm trying to distance myself from being Egyptian or anything, but in reality, not really, because I was even though I grew up in Egypt, the vast majority of my life, I've always felt a little bit kind of like an outsider, like a social weirdo, and kind of treated a little bit as, different, or, Ganzeer
Yeah.
المطار عادة or whatever, there's just like, so I
Yeah.
don't know.
It's interesting. The rapper Lupe Fiasco has this line in one of his songs from a million years ago where he says, "I'm American mentally with Japanese tendencies and Parisian sensibilities." And I like when I come across somebody's work like yours, I always think to myself, what culture did this person consume by the spoonful growing up?
Mm. But that's the thing. So it was an organic mix of like a whole bunch of stuff without necessarily there being any kind of division between, okay, this is Egyptian and this is American and this is Japanese and this is that. It was just like stuff that you just like lands in your orbit in your world, right? So I mean, there were all the things like the things that every Egyptian grew up on. There was, of course, Bugyo Tam Tam, Captain Megid, which is actually not Egyptian, it's Japanese translated, but Messenger, all the things that are just like on TV that everyone consumes. But then also at the same time, I got really into American comic books at a very young age, predominantly like the superhero stuff when I was very young. That changed later. And then at a certain point, when I was a little bit older, started to discover, like specifically when the internet happened, and then you could just like stumble upon things. There was a period where people would put out these like PDF graffiti and street art magazines that were just for free, and essentially they were just like photographs of street art out on the street from different cities. And then so I started to be able to get exposed to that. Without having to leave my house, essentially. And, things like that. It was just like everything and anything,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like, there is definitely this wide array of inputs that's like evident in your work. Now that I'm speaking to you right now, you're in Houston, and you're no longer a teenager. You're many years from that dial-up connection.
You don't have to remind me, dude. All right.
Yeah. But I'm curious if you now see the connective tissue to also the Egypt that you grew up in, those through lines. Now that you have some distance to the 90s and early 2000s, are you looking back and you're like, oh yeah, that I actually didn't notice how much of Egypt was influencing me?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I think even the things that I'm making that is just like very not necessarily, Egyptian in subject matter at all.
Yeah.
I think there's a part of like the Egyptian environment that I grew up in that kind of influences the approach, if you will.
What do you mean by that? Tell me more about that. I'm curious.
All right. So, in Egypt, everything is a joke. In a way. Yeah. Like two people, there's no such thing as two people just saying hello and ending it there and then going along, going off their thing. Like if you're going to say hello, then the other person has to respond with like a joke. And you know what I mean? There's just like always, it's just like so ingrained in like our interactions in a way. So in a way, also at the same time, I feel even when I'm working, for example, on very serious subject matters in the art, I can't just get away with that. There being at least like some kind of sly little bit of sense of humor somewhere in there.
Yeah.
In some way, which may not be evident to everyone, but I think it's there.
Yeah, there is like a levity and a cynicism that is baked into just like everyday communication.
Right. Yeah, that's I think so as well.
Yeah. Okay, so if I were speaking to you when you were in your 20s, would you have described yourself as an artist or as a designer?
In my 20s, I would have described myself as a designer. and probably more specifically a graphic designer.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of folks who are graphic designers have, at least in my life, I feel like when they were kids, they liked art. And then they got subtly pushed into becoming graphic designers.
Right.
And never bounced back. They never actually were able to muster up the courage to say, no, actually, I'm an artist. When did you first muster up that courage?
It would have been around 2010-ish, around 9 or 10. So basically, for me, I followed that trajectory almost to the T, exactly like you described it, where I grew up just interested in all visual art. I couldn't differentiate between, well, this is design or this is, art or whatever. It's just all visually interesting things to me, and consuming all of that and kind of like, composting it inside the weird thing that is our brains and our experiences. And then whatever would come out is what would come out. And then in my 20s, like you said, I basically started working in the graphic design field and becoming successful in that area. And so started to identify as, okay, I'm a graphic designer, essentially. And then basically for me, what happens is any self-respecting person who works in kind of a very commercial, a creative field, but then it's very commercial, right? Where what you're doing, your output is specifically for the purpose of serving the purely commercial needs of another business of some kind. That's essentially what the job entails. And that is like whether you're doing commercial graphic design, you're in advertising, you're in branding, the list goes on. So in that realm, and if you grew up as kind of thinking of yourself as an artist at a certain point, just because you start to do this commercial stuff, you're not going to be able to come to terms with saying like, oh, I'm no longer an artist. I'm just like a cog in the machine of the corporate kind of machine, right? You think of yourself outside of that and you still think of yourself in artistic terms. And in order to do that, you have to convince yourself that what you're doing is actually not really what it is, right? You take out that objective, it's just this, it's just a job, it's just for that. And you say like, no, it has a higher purpose. If you're advertising, if you speak to advertisers, people like creative directors and everything, they're going to say, no, I'm providing entertainment value through the ads I make because it has kind of a bit of a narrative, a sense of humor, et cetera, et cetera. And graphic design, a lot of graphic designers think of themselves as artists, and they will even go as far as compare themselves to like, well, Leonardo da Vinci did a lot of work for hire. He, painted ceiling pictures, so I'm exactly like da Vinci. And so, there's that argument.
Look, there's the call to action right by
right
the finger.
Exactly, and that's like it's so widespread in kind of the commercial arts, commercial design field. I came to term. I just so happened to be fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on how you look at it, to be offered to start to do some gallery art shows when I was still doing commercial graphic design. And then so doing those other things, I experienced the difference of creating work that is 100% coming from within without any purpose for any other entity, and the difference between doing work that is for other purposes. Not to say that work does not have craft and effort and artistry in it, but it's very different when the entire purpose of the artwork's existence entirely comes from within. And then I started to realize, well, wow, this is very different. And I really want to do this more than this other stuff I've been doing. And so I made the break from graphic design to, I'm an artist. And
yeah, I forget who I was talking to one of the previous conversations. Maklit Hedero. And we were talking about the difference. She's a performer, she's a singer. And I was talking to her about the difference between being an artist and being a performer and what that really means. And that's in the context of the performing arts. And she gave me a really beautiful explanation. And I'd love to sort of put you on the spot. If you were to try to explain it to like a 15-year-old or explain it to a kid, what is the difference between being an artist and being a designer at its essence?
So I know you want like an easy answer, and it's like I'm explaining it to a kid, and it's just like, but I also have to, there's a bit of a caveat here as well, right? Because
Cool.
I do find that being a designer has kind of de facto become being a commercial designer, right? And you even to the point where in schools, at universities, graphic design is taught from the get-go as an entirely commercial medium, a commercial art form, if you will, right? It is entirely for this purpose, and it isn't. Graphic design is a tool that can be used for anything. Like you could do essentially, you could utilize graphic design for things that are entirely non-commercial at all. You could do it for artistic purpose. You could like just tailor it to something else. You could make art that is entirely typographic based, and it's a graphic design, endeavor essentially. And it doesn't have to be commercial. So that's why I just wanted to say there's a difference between being commercial design and just design without the commercial prefix. But if I was to explain to a child, so do you want me to explain the difference between design and art to a child, or commercial design and art?
Like if you were speaking to yourself at 15, right? And and your 15-year-old self was like, I love art and I love all these different types of things. And I've heard of this thing called graphic design and I love it. It looks awesome, right?
Okay.
I like both these things. And you were to sit down and you were like, but there is a difference. And you should be aware of that difference. Not one is better than the other, but you should be aware of the difference of what it means to make graphic design and what it means to make art.
Okay. I will say that, I will tell my younger self, art is 100% pure, unabashed expression. Okay. And graphic design is more concerned with the spatial aesthetics of the surface, in a sense, right? I don't know if my child self will understand that necessarily, but I would start from there. And then maybe my child self will ask questions and be like, well, tell me what you mean about that. Tell me more about what do you mean by spatial?
Yeah. So let me tell you my working definition. You tell me what it's sort of missing. And then I want to get deeper into your art stuff. My working definition is design is trying to solve a problem and art is trying to express a feeling. Wait, hold on.
That is true. That is true. But again, there's like a little bit of a but, right? Because you can make you can do it gets difficult now in this day and age a little bit as kind of the art forms have bled a little bit into each other, because art isn't just like painting or whatever like it used to be a long time ago, right? So I mean, you could do kind of artwork that kind of that does kind of try and posit a solution, even a social solution of some kind, right?
Sure. Yeah.
You could do design, that is like not painterly at all. It's very kind of very designerly and very clean. That is self-expression in a sense. It gets a little bit blurry. Yeah. But that is a very good way of creating a bit of a break. I remember I'm sorry, I don't, if you need to like edit the podcast for this. No, I don't, because we're going on and on. But because I had a conversation with someone who was teaching communication arts, right? And she said communication arts is specifically in her mind for essentially commercial design, advertising, branding. That's communication arts. Okay. And then art, fine art, if you will, is just pure expression. And then, I started to think about it a little more, but okay, hold on, wait a minute. All right. If we talk about like not visual art, right? I asked her, what's your favorite novel? Right. And I can't remember what the novel was, but the second question was, okay, do you think that novel is about communication or a work of art? She's like, no, of course it's a work of art. But then do you mean the novel doesn't communicate anything to you? It's just,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it gets a little blurry. I think in an ideal situation, each would have a little bit of the other, right? Art would have a little bit of communication would have a little bit of art.
Yeah, of course. Okay, thanks for humoring me on that conversation. It's something I've been toying with in my head for a while. So let's go back to the thread. So you decide to become an artist. You start showing your stuff in galleries. Do you immediately realize, oh, this is going to be my career. I'm actually going to be a professional artist. And this is what I'm doing with my life. And I'm using it as a social tool to start, because you mentioned 2010, right? So 2010 is 1 year before 2011. Are you immediately starting to think about, sort of public social criticism, and, political criticism?
Well, I feel like the kind of social commentary aspect was in a lot of my work anyway from before. At a certain point, I lost a lot of like my archive. At a certain point, I was looking at like some of the commercial design stuff I was doing. Some of it would be like interior kind of art in cafes and sort of thing. And then I was surprised that they let me get away with a lot of the stuff I ended up doing, because there was kind of like quite a bit of social commentary in there that was, and in a place like Egypt, social commentary does get political can quite easily, the line blurs there. So I feel like in general that has been a concern of mine for a long time. But basically, the break in 2010, when I felt that way, it was mostly really about like just wanting to feeling a bit drained from the whole like work for hire stuff, and then feeling like so energized from all of my art in a way that I was doing, especially because I had the opportunity of going on several residencies in other countries where you do really, you have the space, you have the time, you're just like sitting there and you work on your stuff. I'm like, this would be really nice. And I was legitimately thinking of moving either out of Cairo, away from all the hustle and bustle and the stress of the big city in a sense, and move to still cities, but like smaller cities, either Ismailia or Alexandria, and just become like a full-time artist. But then I never got around to that because other things happened and got in the way.
Yeah. So let's talk about 2011, one of the maybe other things that got in the way. When you reflect on that now, I know that it's been 10 years, so there's lots of reflection that happens over 10 years. But when you see a photo like this, which is of you, for those folks who are listening to the podcast don't see the screen, this is a photo of you working on this what became an iconic piece, this tank that's on the wall. Are you taken back to a specific emotion, or is this time completely blurred in your head and you're like, I don't even kind of recognize myself there?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the latter.
What do you remember of that moment in time?
I definitely remember the biggest thing I remember, because it's the thing I miss the most, is community. Because you see me like a lonesome dude standing in that picture, but the reality is I was present with like 20 other people. That mural would not have happened without all of these folks who got together to help me, one, cut the stencils to make it, go to the place, transport everything, hold each other. We had one ladder, and these stencil things were like these really, really wide, the whole width of the tank. So on the other end, someone would hold another person up on their shoulders to hold up the stencil to tape it. And it was just like this incredible group effort. Some of them people who I had known for many years, and others people who I had just like met within the previous days or weeks prior to doing this, and like everyone is just it was just like an amazing feeling, and that sense of like people coming together just like to make something happen, and be together, is something I haven't had in a very long time, very long time. And it was just a lot of people want to talk about this period of like the dangers and the threat and the violence and all that stuff. And sure, all that stuff was there, but this was actually the creation of this was actually a very joyous time. We finished this, we went off together, all of us went, got some kushari, you know what I'm saying? It was just it was great.
It's funny when I think, so I was in Beirut in 2019, and still there. But when I think back to those moments where there were these beautiful public art displays of pent-up anger and frustration towards the Nizam and towards the situation, sometimes I look back at them and I'm frustrated with myself for being so naive. And sometimes I look back at them joyfully and I think, oh my God, those were such great times. And, there was this vibration in the air and we're all sort of in the same key. Are you cynical when you look at these photos? Are you sort of, frustrated with yourself, with your naivete, or are you, is it hopeful or some other type of emotion?
Honestly, it's probably like sadder than all of that. There's just like, for me, there's this complete detachment. Like it almost feels like, is this like a false memory? Is this like some made up, like there's just like, just because, a change in, change in time and environment and relations, and when your entire existence and the entire world that you exist in is just like completely different from the world that existed in, and this difference has existed for a very long time. It almost feels like you're not sure whether that actually happened, or it was like some kind of like dream that you dreamt maybe, and you can't tell the difference or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I relate to that. I want to switch gears a little bit. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the public stuff, but and talk a little bit about some of your publishing. For those who don't know anything about it, what's the Solar Grid?
The Solar Grid is a science fiction graphic novel that has been many years in the works. Basically it is it takes place after the world has suffered from a mass environmental catastrophe, namely a global flood, which prompts the population of Earth to migrate to Mars. But of course, not every single person on the planet can make that migration. In fact, most people do get left behind on Earth, the vast majority of people. So without actually getting too deep into it in the novel, that of course in and of itself raises questions of like race, nationality, gender, sexuality, and so on. So most people get left behind, and those who do get to leave to start over on Mars do so only after constructing what is called the solar grid, the titular solar grid, which is essentially a network of satellites that orbit the planet Earth, and keep it basked in eternal daylight. So night has been eliminated from Earth, and this is predominantly to power these solar factories on Earth that run on solar energy, so they could keep operating 24/7 without stopping, with the goods primarily designed for export to Mars. and then Mars sends the waste back to Earth.
Okay, so I feel like the skills needed to write something like this are completely independent from all of the other work that you're doing. Did you feel completely out of your element, or is this just like a card up your sleeve that had been sort of waiting to play? Like the idea of writing an entire novel, a graphic novel, and thinking through that entire story arc. Were you intimidated by this process at all?
Yes.
The short answer, yes.
Yes.
The survey says yes.
Yeah, no, you're right. It is. But at the same time, it's something that's been percolating. I think inside me for a long time, where I always felt like, as much as I'm proud of a lot of the work I've done in the past, the various kinds of visual art. It did feel like it was just like for me, like a sliver of conception, in a sense, right?
Wait, a sliver of conception. What does that mean?
Okay, so okay, all right. Let's take. We just looked at the tank, for example. Mural of the tank, yeah. And it's a tank facing off with a man on a bicycle, right? Who's carrying a tray of bread on his head, right? Yeah. So it's a very kind of shorthand depiction of visualization in one single image that is pivots, basically, that says, all right, so the pivots the military as a body, as an institution, against the livelihood of the everyday Egyptian, right?
Yeah.
Embodied in that bread biker. And it's done in one single image, but then that as a subject matter, right, as an idea to dive into, can be dove into much more deeper with many nuances and layers to kind of like explain, well, why that is. And there's a lot to it, right?
Yeah.
And you can't really get into a lot to it with a single image of street art painted on a wall, right? You just get like the sliver of the idea of the concept, right? Yeah. And a lot of visual art for me that I've created anyway. I'm not saying for all of visual art in general. A lot of it had to be in that mode of thinking, right? You present the best thing that can be presented in that particular mode, right?
Yeah.
And then the rest isn't there. So basically, within this kind of a graphic novel, there is like this opportunity to be like, okay, well, I have a narrative, I have characters, I have timelines, you could really kind of get into something that's really layered and maybe too layered in the case of the solar grid. I don't know.
Yeah. Is there work that you've done over the course of your career that you look at now and you really don't like?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yeah, yes. The short answer is yes, everything.
Wait, everything?
Everything, right? And what I mean by that is like every single thing that you end up doing ends up being not quite how you pictured it before doing it, right? So in the conception, before the actual doing, you're like, oh, this is going to be the best thing anyone has ever made in the history of making things, right? And then you make it and you're like, it didn't quite turn out exactly like I had pictured it, but that's fine. That's fuel to move on to the next project and try and do that one better. So on one hand, like I feel like, okay, everything I kind of see it that way, but on the other hand, I acknowledge that, well, the result has to do with the circumstances surrounding it, its creation, and it's fine. It's not like I can't look at it anymore. Like I acknowledge that it's a time capsule of the moment it was created in a sense.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard for artists. I mean, insofar as an expression, I feel like I have a hard time like reading my own diary. I'm like, oh my God, geez, you're so annoying.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I can't imagine like reading my diary from like, 20 years ago. I must
Yeah.
sound like a complete idiot to myself, probably.
So I guess this is the sort of point of my question is, you know, me reading my diary from 20 years ago, I sound like a complete idiot. That's one thing. But people posting photos online of my quote unquote diary and celebrating it from 20 years ago feels like a cringe, a type of cringe that I'm not familiar with, that you might be familiar with. Like if somebody's like celebrating work from, like, I mean, maybe what I'm doing right now, I'm showing work from years past that maybe you're cringing at and be like, oh, that's not me. Why are you, why are you showing that? Do you ever feel that way?
Not really. I mean, it's sort of like, it's exactly like, the cover picture, that you guys chose. It's like a picture of me from probably 10 years ago or something like that. I can't remember, like a very long time ago. And I'm like, I look different now because I'm an older person. I could have been like, wait a minute, that's not me. But like, it's fine. We're talking about me and not just me in the now, but also the me of the then and the me in different periods.
Yeah.
And in a way that applies to the art as well. We don't only have to talk about the art of that is the now, and it's fine. I'm it's not like I cringe, but I could tell, like, sure, I could see how it could have been better, I guess.
I want to ask you about community. Like you'd mentioned that photo of you, there's like all these different people and you guys all got kushedi later. And it's, but I want to sort of zoom out and think regionally and maybe even globally. Do you feel like you're a part of a class of artists from the Arab world who are sort of unpacking the same challenges in a sort of transnational type of way? Do you feel bonded with other folks in like Tunisia and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, and not only bonded like stylistically, but also you guys are all talking and thinking about the same things and working through similar things in concert and in sort of commune?
No. But what you're saying is true. But I don't feel it, if that makes sense. Meaning, I spend just a lot of time alone working on stuff alone, and I'm just, it's just a very lonesome existence to a large degree, which is very different from, those particular Cairo years, so being with people in actual meat space, an actual real
in real life
meet life, right, is very different from like, okay, so yes, we are aware of each other's existence through like social media or whatever, it's not the same. And also, like, I generally actually am not like in communication. I don't feel like I'm in communication really with this class of artists internationally. I'm not actually, but on the other hand, I was recently attended a workshop, not a workshop. It was more of a multiple day convening, a 3-day convening at the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, Michigan.
Yeah.
And so they brought all these kind of practitioners, artists who practice in different modes. There were poets, there were performance artists, there perfume artist, or someone who works with scents and so on, like Dana. Very different. Dana, Dana. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So all these folks in different fields, and on one hand, it was it was very enriching to actually be with people where mostly people, or actually all people I had never met actually before. I was meeting for the first time. But then where I felt like it wasn't the same as meeting just anyone for the first time. It felt like, okay, no, there's like a lot of introductory stuff that we don't have to go through at all. And we're just like, we click right away in a sense. And also it was also flattering to be like a lot of the people being like, oh, hey, I love your work and I know your work, and which I don't know that anyone knew my work. I don't know, so I wouldn't know otherwise. So I guess there is that connection that's sort of there, but it's not something that I feel on a day-to-day basis or anything. It's had we not had this convening, I wouldn't know that there was any connection of any kind.
Yeah, I kind of got that sense from you. I was doing research, getting ready for this, and I kind of got the sense that you may not be aware of your influence. Like, I mean, like if 20-some-year-old Egyptians or artists from Baghdad come up to you and they're like, "Oh my God, you shaped the way I want to do art," would you be like, "What are you talking about?"
Yes, I would be. What are you talking about? 100%. Like,
that's
I don't know, dude. I'm just a middle-aged man making things in Houston, Texas now. I don't know what's going on anymore.
Yeah. It's funny because you read history books, right? And you read books, and it's these names that have now become sort of, iconic, right? You hear like Ibrahim Salahi, is part of this movement in Sudan, or this person, is part of this movement and this movement, and you think of them as collectives.
Right, exactly.
And you think of these people as like holding hands and being in a group chat, being all friends and sort of like getting together constantly. And to some extent that is true, but it's true for these brief moments. And those moments get sort of caught on camera and become iconic photos. But the reality is that most of it is a solitary existence. Like most of the movie is boring and the person is alone.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's true. But there's a part of me that like wonders, like, was it really that way for like everyone? Like, you mean there weren't like, there wasn't like a whole, like a gang of maverick artists, creators, just like getting together all the time and like riffing off each other and like that kind of, like, I would really like for that to happen, maybe because I like lived it for a very short period of time as well. And I feel like, well, if it was possible for a short period of time, why can't it be like a thing? Like it could be someone's entire existence. I don't know. It would be nice.
Yeah, it would be. So let me open up to some of the questions in the chat. But before we do, if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat. We'll do this rapid fire quick Q&A. And if there aren't any questions, I will have tons more. So what are you reading or watching these days?
These days, I am reading a book called Stargazer. See the subtitle. It's a book on Andy Warhol by I can believe it. Anyway, that's a book called Stargazer.
It's fiction?
No. This is
I was going to say
more like it's called Stargazer: The Life, World, and Films of Andy Warhol, and it's very very well written. And actually, like the part I'm reading now, kind of brought me back to some of those old memories, a little bit of being in Cairo with kind of a bunch of people and stuff. Because however we consume things, read things, we relate to differently, I guess. But anyway, reading that, and I'm watching White Lotus on HBO.
Okay. If you could, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Tough one. I would say, and Bob Dylan, 1964.
Okay, so we have done almost 300 of these episodes, maybe 250 of these episodes. And I've asked this question almost every single one of them. And no one has ever said the day, the year. And I usually ask that as a follow-up. People say like Bob Dylan, I'll say like, what year? You're the first person who actually goes out of their way to say the year. Why
Well,
1964?
well, because there's the Bob Dylan in the 70s is it the same Bob Dylan in 1964, and you could sort of like see. I could imagine that maybe around 1964 there, when he was just in that kind of rise to popularity, kind of getting very kind of producing so much music, and at the same time experimenting with a lot of music. But also not popular to the point where he is absent from the kind of the bohemian circles and the radicals, and the thinkers and so on. It was probably around the time where he kind of started hanging out with Allen Ginsberg and stuff. Like I feel like, okay, if I shout out Bob Dylan for a day in that part on that particular year, chances are it's probably going to be a pretty interesting day.
Yeah. Would you say, I mean, Dylan's still alive, but are there any modern day Dylans that are, like in their 30s, 40s, that you feel like there's some sort of corollary?
Well, I mean, again, I would be reluctant to say like full on this person is a modern day Dylan, right?
Sure.
But I would say, okay, there's an aspect of Dylan in them. So I would say, there is an aspect of a particular piece, strain that is present in, I would say, Rami Assam, and also in Mustafa. He wrote the book of poetry called Manifesto. Do you know that one?
I don't know if somebody in the chat can look it up.
Mustafa Brahim. There you go. Yeah, okay. There's a little bit of that in Mustafa Brahim. I would say again, like I'm reluctant to draw the full on comparison, but sure. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. Okay, let's keep on going. What would you say people most misunderstand about your work?
That it's political. I don't think that it necessarily is.
Okay, so I'm very curious about this. Would you say that it's not political because you think that is used as a slight, or do you think that's used to mischaracterize your intentions, or do you think that it's used because it sort of simplifies what you're trying to do, or it's just completely off the mark?
No, I think the work is a combination of two things. For me, the way I see it is it's mostly social, right? So if you were to take out like the politics of the day, the persons who are involved in the politics of the day, the institution, and you were to take all that out, the social aspect of the work would still apply in my mind. So that's A. So it's mostly social cultural in a sense, and B, the other aspect, it is a personal expression. A lot of the time it's a personal expression in relation to the social cultural, I feel, and that's what I'm concerned with doing.
Yeah, is it so? Let me ask this, let me clarify. So is the idea that you don't care about politics, you care about society and culture, and that's why it's not political?
Yeah, to an extent, like, because political,
like, whose art is political? If your art isn't political, whose art is political? What's an example of a political artist that you're like, yeah, they're awesome and they're political?
Awesome and political. No, sorry, I didn't mean it to sound that way.
Like that's a bridge too far, Mikey.
No, I don't. Oh, that's I guess a little bit not entirely easy. Okay. All right. So okay, here's what I mean. I feel like a political artwork could easily, very, very easily be used in the context of a protest, right? And I feel for me, the vast majority of what I have done probably doesn't quite fit that it wouldn't really work on a signage, on a political sign, because it wouldn't be close enough to or direct enough to the cause in question or something. That's the vast majority. I mean, maybe there are some exceptions, but I just mean as a whole. And also, political art tends to become too you're with this side against that side sort of thing, right? Yeah. Like there's a political side that you identify with, and you're with them, and you make it clear through the art that you are with that side, and then you are against the other side. For me, I feel like there are quite few nuances in my stuff where actually it doesn't seem like it's clear where the side is, because there are no sides. I think everyone is full of shit. So I don't know. So I mean, okay. So for example, if you were to take, but then this is okay, I guess this is an unfair example because it's a narrative work and it's large and layered. But like take the solar grid, for example.
Yeah.
So obviously there's an argument against environmental destruction and the use of, and big industry, fossil fuels, all that stuff, right? But at the same time, it's not like I'm saying, okay, the solution is everyone has to go solar and then the planet will be saved, because I actually, in fact, create a solar dystopia where they are using solar, but to an extreme extent where it's actually like still very, very harmful, right?
Yeah.
So the simplistic answers that are quite common, in my view, in the politics of the day, whether it's expressed through the politics of the day, the writing of the politics of the day, or the visual art of the politics of the day, I feel I don't quite identify with, and I'm looking for something a bit beyond that.
Yeah. Okay. So you're using using comedy as an example. The Daily Show is political. George Carlin is social cultural.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So the political art is designed to convince you. The social cultural art is designed to make you think.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay. All right. I understand now. So whose work, this question always sort of gets misinterpreted, which is the failure of my writing, but like whose work do you go to consistently in order to drum up inspiration?
Consistently.
Or occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a sponge a little bit. So I take, from everything and, everyone. But, the regulars, if you could say, I love Ammar Abu Bakr's work. I love Hoda Lutfi's work so much. My friend Karim Lutfi, whose work I haven't seen in a long time, but very, way back in the day, I would say like I used to like just be blown away by the work that he did. And so, and that's, and his kind of approach and his way of thinking, I think I find highly influential. But I haven't seen his work in a long time, unfortunately. Other works, so all those folks work in kind of the visual art, gallery art, something, whatever you want to call it, vein. But I also, I read a lot of comics. I love Dina Muhammad's work.
Yeah, she's good. She was on the series.
Big, yeah, she's amazing, and that graphic novel is like superb, absolutely fantastic. I love, there are other like really big historical go-tos. Like there's Mobius, who is always influential. There's Sergio Topi, Italian graphic novelist, also very amazing. Mike Mignola, Hellboy. In terms of film, I love Quentin Tarantino. And actually, I should say a friend of mine who doesn't work. His name is Haitham Abu Samra, and he works in, I believe he's in the advertising field now. And a long time ago, he used to be a graphic designer, but his thinking and his interests and his tastes, I find, have have influenced me at a young age and continue to influence me to this day. Although, again, it's been like, maybe that more over a decade since we've spoken, but these are the influences that stay. So yeah, many, 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 many influences.
Amazing. Okay, I'm good. There's one question in the chat is from Reno. Thanks for this great conversation. I'm curious about the tools and software you use in your work. Did you upgrade the software you used through the years, like using iPad Pro, or you prefer using traditional tools? I saw you use inks, for example.
Yeah, I have never held an iPad in my life. So definitely not that. I do use some, Photoshop, Illustrator, so on and so forth. These, of course, are tools I learned back in my graphic design days. And yeah, they're tools that are aids, I find them, but I typically use them in conjunction with very traditional tools, paper, ink, which I feel like a lot of the actual art making is done that way, and everything else is just sort of like an additional aid, so it's mostly traditional tools, paper, ink, paint, so on and so forth.
Amazing. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you're working on now that people should eagerly await?
The Solar Grid, my graphic novel, is primarily what I'm working on, and that should come to a conclusion in 2023.
So it's coming out in chapters, so people can find it online, and it comes out in sort of editions.
Exactly. So yeah, but the whole series should be finally complete and end in 2023. I also have a short story, science fiction story, coming out in the big book of cyberpunk, which should be out in also 2023. And otherwise, I just put up prints and stuff on my web store, garage.ganzeer.com. That's mostly it.
That's amazing. Well, Ganzeer, thanks so much for making the time to chat and for fielding my questions.
Absolutely.
This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me.
So everyone, this is going to show up on the podcast and on our YouTube page. If you don't already subscribe, please do so. Leave us a comment and a like and a thumbs up, and we will see you on Friday. Thanks so much, everybody.